Well, first and foremost, I must congratulate South Korea for hosting this year's, private sector investment fund, right there with the Green Climate Fund. Korea is the right place to have it because President Moon Jae-in has the right vision, the right strategy. They have launched a 15-year strategy on electricity and energy for their country, where they're hoping to be able to reach 20% of their energy generation through renewable energy, which is really great. I myself, I went to South Korea. They hosted us this year for the annual meetings of the African Development Bank, and they did a fantastic job. And I was able to see a lot of work that they are doing on renewable energy. So couldn't have chosen a better place. The Green Climate Fund is there, and you have a country that's very, very focused on making sure that it deals with the issue of climate. So congratulations to them. I think in particular for the private sector, I think looking for ways in which we can harness the power of private sector on innovations and finance for green climate finance would be the best thing to happen to our climate change agenda. Well, for private sector, the role of, if you take a look at how much money we actually need to address climate change in Africa from the nationally determined contributions, it's a lot of money. We're talking about $5 trillion by 2030. And that's just for the whole world. But if you take the case of Africa, Africa will need, my goodness, $3 trillion to be made available. And that's still, that money is not there. But if you look at what is it that Africa actually gets today, Africa gets roughly about maybe, no more than 4% of total global climate finance coming to the continent. It's only $12 billion. It's not a whole lot of money. So it doesn't matter how much government wants to do or willing to do. We do need a lot of investment from the private sector. So critical issue is how do you attract the private sector and how do you reduce the risk of investment by the private sector? I think the opportunities for private sector are immense. They're immense in terms of innovations, in the renewable energy space. They are immense when it comes to the use of fourth industrial revolution technologies that can support, the use of drones to be able to determine, degradation or weather patterns. It goes to the whole issue of, private sector developing the storage systems that can allow you to do renewable energy. Private sector investments in automobile, electric cars, it's a big area for private sector. But there are also financial innovations that the private sector can bring, in particular in terms of insurance. How do you insure countries against the negative impacts of climate change? And how do you also, ensure that as you support climate, that you are also using technologies that can allow you to increase energy efficiency? These are areas in which the private sector can play a big role. So I see huge opportunities for the private sector, and I'm glad that we're talking about that. The private sector, will always see opportunities, but they also see risks. And so the big thing that we have to do is to make sure that as we see the opportunities for the private sector, that multilateral development finance institutions like ourselves help the private sector to mitigate the risk. There are ways in which the African Development Bank, as well as other multilateral finance institutions, by the way, are addressing this issue. One is the private sector wants to develop projects. There are not enough, bankable projects on the table. Money is not the problem. We got about $120 trillion of assets under management globally, right? Yet we know that the needs are big on infrastructure for energy and water and all of that we have to deal with on that climate smart investments. Question is, how do you connect both? For African Development Bank, we do quite a lot in terms of use of partial risk guarantees and partial credit guarantees that covers the obligations of the government, for example, to a private entity in case the government does not meet its own obligation. And in the case of private to private sector entities, we also cover the risk of counterparty obligations in case that's not met. That's what we do to reduce the risk of investments. And they work very, very well. We did it to support Morocco to build the new Ouarzazate, which is the world's largest power plant that is all done by solar. We did the same in Kenya, by the way, for the Lake Turkana project, which is Africa's largest project on wind power. We also did a lot with geothermal, where we're covering the risk that if you do the exploration and you don't get the steam, then somebody's got to cover that cost. We cover those kind of costs. So I think that the use of risk-sharing instruments is the best way to support the private sector to reduce their risk of investment. But beyond that is the overall business investment and regulatory environment. If you are going to be making investment, for example, in renewable energy, you want to ask yourself, what's the cost-reflective tariff? Am I going to be able to recover my cost? And is the policy and regulatory environment stable enough for me to stay there? So we, as African Development Bank, get involved to, let me say, make it a lot easier for private sector to make their investments in the case of Africa. And that's very important. Yeah, if you take a look at climate, quite a lot of people, I hear sometimes people say, well, is it really real? Well, ask me. I'm president of African Development Bank, and I've visited so many countries. I see a lot of challenges that they face in terms of drought. I see a lot of problems they face in terms of flood. And so the ways in which we have to help African countries is to adapt to climate change. Look, Africa has been shortchanged in terms of climate finance. I just said that 4% of global finance actually comes to Africa. But Africa should not be shortchanged in terms of climate. Africa has been shortchanged in terms of climate change, but it should not be shortchanged in terms of climate finance. So Africa needs a lot of money for that. For adaptation is particularly critical. Let me tell you why. But because if you take the case of drought, farmers will lose their crop. You take floods, you have a lot of erosion that will wash away, public investment in infrastructure. So we are trying to address this in a number of ways. First is that we are supporting in Africa the African countries to have what we call, they pay for insurance to insure themselves against catastrophic risk events. So the African Development Bank actually pays the insurance premium for African countries to insure themselves against adverse weather patterns. Second, we actually have launched a massive program which is called Say No to Famine, wherein we give grant support countries to support adaptation in the case of drought. There are other mechanisms that we support for countries. We support the disaster monitoring and management systems for African countries so that they can prepare in case of any eventualities that does arise from this. And finally, the other thing that we do for African countries in this area is simply to look at the meteorological services, because to be able to predict that a drought will happen, you need very good meteorological services. So the African Development Bank is investing in infrastructure that will allow you to be able to determine that. And finally, is the whole issue of crop insurance. Crop insurance, livestock insurance for farmers and for herders. We invest quite a lot in those areas. These are very important mechanisms that will help to transfer the risk off from the farmers that are vulnerable back into the market system. Well, you want to, if you look at the market opportunities, in Africa with regard to climate, I think first and foremost is investing in infrastructure. Climate resilient infrastructure is a big opportunity. Investment in renewable energy is a big one. Investing in water and sustainable cities. These are all big areas for investments in infrastructure. But take, for example, just the case of renewable energy for Africa. It's massive. God is so good to us as a continent. We have free sun. If you look at the amount of irradiation we have in Africa, is one of the highest in the world. So we have no basis to not have electricity. But how do you turn solar into electricity? We have a potential of 11 terawatts in terms of solar. But you don't eat potential. You don't just say, I want to light up my house using potential. You got to light it up you have to unblock that potential. So renewable energy is a massive area. But if you're going to use renewable energy, especially solar, you also have to get investment business opportunity in batteries, storage business. So in Africa today, the market for storage of solar is massive. It's about $2.5 billion a year that you're going to have. So that's a big market opportunity for people to look at. So in essence, the opportunities are there in energy, they are there in agriculture, they are there in other types of infrastructure. At the end of the day is how do we do financing, to taking public finance and taking that with private sector to blend it so that the cost of access to capital can be much lower for those that want to invest and take advantage of this massive amount of opportunities. If you look in Africa, for example, just on infrastructure, climate resilient infrastructure, you look at agriculture, you look at sustainable cities and water, that could mean a market opportunity of up to $3 trillion by 2030. Just think about it. So it's all in our interest to make sure we can crowd finance into climate resilient investments on the continent. You know, whenever you take a look at life will throw all kinds of challenges at you. You got two choices. One is to moan about the challenges. The other one is to take the challenges as avenues for opportunities. And so we must always look for opportunities. I think we shouldn't have a mindset of we're being beaten down by climate. Look, it's not going to get us anywhere. We know that. The issue is we should look for the opportunities. What are the opportunities in renewable energy? What are the opportunities that are there in climate resilient infrastructure, quality infrastructure, for example? What are the opportunities that are there that we can actually leverage significant amount of global capital to go into these particular areas? What opportunities are there for us to use public money to be able to leverage more from the private sector? And what opportunities are there for us to set up good regulatory environments and make sure that we all have sustainable low carbon growth pathways? And so for me, I hope that the participants at this meeting will look at the opportunities and not get bogged down with the challenges. Every time I hear about climate change, it's all about the problems. But what about the opportunities? So we must change our perspective from just becoming problem-oriented to solutions and opportunities orientation. That's what I hope. And I would like to say that for us at the African Development Bank, we aren't just going to be waiting for the rest of the world to sort out this problem before we move forward as a continent. You know, we've set up something called the African Financial Alliance for Climate Change, which is basically bringing together all the stock exchanges in Africa, the financial institutions, bringing the regulators together and asking, how do we decarbonize Africa's growth pathway? We're going to be setting up what's called the African Decarbonization Index, which will now help us to look at companies and their carbon emission pathways and how do we reduce that and how do we give them more incentives. We have decided that we must take the bull by the horn by ourselves and actually help Africa to grow in a way that is actually low carbon trajectory growth pathway. So that's all about opportunities, right? Mm. So let's keep focused on opportunities. Oh, absolutely. Let me say that Africa, you know, is the place to be. The massive amount of opportunities for energy, it's there. The African Development Bank has set up this forum that's called the Africa Investment Forum. We're bringing the global investors to Africa to look at projects on infrastructure, on energy, on agriculture, and all range of things that we have just talked about. But the critical thing that makes this Africa Investment Forum different is how do we help you to de-risk your projects? And so the African Development Bank plus all the multilateral finance institutions, we have pooled our resources together and we say, is it project risk? Is it market risk? Is it political risk? We can pool our resources together to help private sector agents to reduce the risk. And finally, at this African Investment Forum, there will be already $120 billion worth of bankable projects on this platform of the Africa Investment Forum. So it will reduce your search costs of looking for bankable projects on the continent. And if I might end by just simply saying, what we want to do for Africa is use the Africa Investment Forum as a, let me say, as a smooth landing strip for your investments in Africa without any bumps. That's what we're trying to do.